Coming up next on Public Access TV is Fan to Fan, the Book Game, a half-hour interview show where we talk with authors about their books and how they got them into print. Today, my guest will be Melissa Ludtke, a pioneering sports writing woman whose new book, Locker Room Talk, A Woman's Struggle to Get Inside. It tells the story of how she won a breakthrough legal case back in 1978 to gain access to the formerly all-men's locker room as a female reporter. Stay tuned. This will inspire and energize. It may even open a door for you. Welcome to Fan, the Book Game. Hi, I'm your host, Dave Hornfischer. Today I'm pleased to welcome author Melissa Ludtke, a Sports Illustrated reporter who back in 1978, frustrated by her inability to gain access to baseball locker rooms, took her case to court, and she won. She's now written a book titled Locker Room Talk, A Woman's Struggle to Get Inside, on her door-busting effort. She's here today to share her story. Welcome, Melissa.
Well, thank you so much. It's fun to be in Framingham.
Well, great. You had to come all the way from Cambridge.
I did. It's a long ways, but I made it.
Well, good for you. Anyway, now having you made it here, why don't you go back a bit and tell us how you got started in the publishing business, the book business, or the magazine business, I guess, and how this all kind of evolved.
Well, I somewhat call it my magical carpet ride there because I went to nearby Wellesley College, majored in art history, always participated in sports as I'd done before I got to that college.
We got a couple of pictures here of your athletic.
Oh, you do? Okay. Well, I was a tomboy. When I was growing up, that's what they called us, tomboy.
There you are, ready to hit a softball, I guess.
Yeah, evidently. So when I got out of Wellesley College, I had an art history major, but no interest really in working in that field. And so I thought back to what I knew and what I loved, which was sports. And so eventually I moved to New York City. I began I got a job during the day to pay the rent. And then I basically found my way into sort of hanging out and doing some sideline work with ABC Sports. Not sidelines in the sense of speaking and talking on sidelines of games, but I acted as a gopher, which was really an intern position. But I got to know a lot of people. And one of those people was the person who introduced me to the person who hires at Sports Illustrated. And that's really how I came to get my first job, which was as a researcher reporter at Sports Illustrated magazine.
And there you are with in your Sports Illustrated office.
There I am with an actual telephone.
Yeah, so they let you have a phone back then even.
Absolutely.
Okay, and then from there you started to become aware of this stuff. And how did you connect to the baseball scene?
Well, baseball is the sport I always loved. If you'd asked me which sport I followed most when I was a child, it would have been baseball, and that's because of my mother. She was an absolute baseball fan, had been so with her own father, going to Fenway Park with him.
So they were Red Sox fans?
Up. They were definitely Red Sox fans. And so from the moment that I was literally born through probably my toddlerhood, she was listening and watching to Red Sox games, and I would be picking it up with her. And over time, I developed my own interest in baseball and in Red Sox. So when I did get hired at Sports Illustrated, the position that I really craved was that of being able to be a researcher reporter on the baseball beat at the magazine. Okay. And I finally achieved that in about 1995, 96, going into those seasons. So
This is back in the 70s, though.
That was in the 70s. I was 24 years old. Right. You know, working for the world's largest and most well-known sports magazine. I had never really written much before I got there, so I had a lot of it. Had a tough learning curve in terms of learning how to report and write stories. My basic job and what I get paid for was to fact check the stories that most of the men were writing. But I also was given the opportunity to hang out around the baseball stadiums. I had a pass from the American League and the National League that gave me access to all the stadiums. And so I would spend my free time during the evenings going up and hanging out around the ball games, getting to know the players, getting to hang out, and understand how the game was covered. And so that's kind of how I began my
But you weren't writing stories at that point.
I was writing some stories.
Okay.
It turned out that I was also trying desperately to learn how to write sports. And so I would come up with ideas, and on my own time again, I'd go off and try to report those stories, and I'd write them, and some of them were accepted and some of them weren't.
And is this when you ran into the experience of not being able to get into the locker room before or after a game?
It wasn't really then, no. During the first couple of seasons, it was pretty well understood by everyone that women did not have access to the clubhouses. And I pretty much understood that that seemed to be a fairly solid rule. So I did a lot of my reporting during batting practice and other times, and tried to do it as best I could. But with the Yankees, I really kind of began to push the envelope a little bit. And by the 1977 season, halfway through the season, the PR person ended up taking me into the manager's office, which was inside the clubhouse after the games. And by the end of that season, they'd given me a daily clubhouse pass for the last 2 games, which I used to report before the games, which were between batting practice and when the game started. And then during the American League Championship Series, I was reporting inside the clubhouse. To me, the interesting thing was that no one cared. No one seemed to notice. No one wrote a story about it. It was only when we got to the World Series in 1977 when Commissioner Kuhn decided to ban me from the clubhouse and ban my access.
That's the picture I think we have of
that I ended up in a situation.
Men only?
Men only, yes. That's basically how it was understood. But it was during the 1977 World Series that Commissioner Kuhn ended up banning me from all clubhouse access.
And that came right down from the top. It wasn't so much
Commissioner Kuhn is the top.
Yes, right. But the Yankees, it wasn't a Yankee issue. It was more the...
It was not a Yankee issue. It was not a Dodger issue. That's who was playing in the World Series. In fact, both of those teams had given permission, knowing that I had a baseball pass that gave me permission to come into the clubhouse. The Dodgers had actually taken a vote on that question right before the World Series started, and they'd voted for me to be able to have that access. And so the commissioner decided that he would defy, essentially, the votes and the decisions of those 2 teams, and he would deny me my access. And that is why I ended up as the plaintiff in the case to try to open the access for myself and for other women. It wasn't that I took him on in a fight of my calling. It was in reaction to him banning me.
Did you ever have a sense as to why that mattered so much to him? I mean, if the players and the team were...
Well, we had a lot of sense. I mean, he wrote affidavits. We deposed him for the hearing. He made very clear in interviews he did that he believed that he was protecting what he called the sexual privacy of his players. Now, what we came to understand as we deposed him, my lawyer deposed him for the hearing and asked him questions that led us to come to an understanding that in making his decision, he had never spoken to one player. So while he said that he was doing this to protect my players, from me and defending what he called their sexual privacy, I never quite understood what he meant by that, particularly before the game when the players were all in their uniforms and I was still prohibited from being in there. But that was where he was coming from. He just felt that a woman's place wasn't there. And because he believed that he could treat me in a way that would say he would keep me separate, but he would say that he would make my experience in covering the game and getting to my sources equal, that wasn't true. It could not happen. If I was going to have equal access, I had to have access in the same place and at the same time as the male sports writers who were doing the same job.
So you began to get frustrated. I think we have a picture of something here that relates to that. There we go. This was a news article, I guess, that appeared from the Sports Wire. It said that about you were a pioneer, it says.
Well, evidently that's what people want to call me now. I just felt like I was the girl who wanted to do her job.
There weren't others trying to...
There were other women who were sports writers at the time, but most of them, being the first woman at a newspaper sports department, were assigned to either hockey or basketball. None of them were assigned to cover baseball.
Oh, that's right. You say in your book that hockey and basketball opened the doors much sooner.
They did. They opened them in 1975, and that was an action taken by the commissioner of the NBA and by the president of the NHL. And that's because they had women covering them. They wanted the free media that newspapers gave them. That was the way that sports fans read about what was happening on the field and drew them into the stands. So in both of those leagues, they opened it up. At the same time that those leagues were opened up, we came to learn later in the discovery phase of our trial or our hearing that that's exactly when the commissioner actually sat down and crafted his policy for baseball, which is basically to say that no woman will have access to the clubhouse.
It just strikes me as bizarre that this issue would become a commissioner issue. I mean, you think of the commissioner as setting up, major playing rules, major ways to raise revenue for baseball and all that. Why the commissioner would
But he felt it was related to revenue, you see. Yeah. He felt that if baseball had such a thing where women were going into clubhouses, he viewed their fan base as more conservative than the fan base for basketball or hockey. That's what he viewed it.
Yeah.
He felt that it was a family-friendly sport, that it was a sport where, and he's right. I mean, he's right in the sense that people brought their kids to the stadium. They enjoyed the afternoon at the ballpark with their families, more so than perhaps the hockey games in the NBA, which were often held more in the evenings.
Yeah.
And so you did understand from a perspective that he saw it from, the framing, that it was a more conservative sport. And he testified and wrote in his affidavit that he was also trying to protect the financial well-being of his sport.
So this happens in '77 in the World Series.
Yep.
And then but then the case kind of gets some publicity. I mean, we've got a couple of pictures of a couple cute cartoons coming up here, which is sort of a sign that somebody beside you was onto this issue, that it was a problem. I mean,
it wasn't so much.
I mean, we got a cartoon like this with the big lock, and then we even have a Charlie Brown comic coming up here, and Lucy saying, "I don't want to be a reporter anyway," and you didn't give up.
Well, I mean, the cartoons that you're showing here came after our suit was filed, or our case was filed with the federal court, and they were really in response to it. Again, this wasn't an issue on anyone's radar screen before my case came into public view. But once it did come onto public view, you had an enormous amount of press coverage. That included cartoonists getting into the action, as well as writers, as well as the radio commentators with some of the early talk radio shows. And then to top it off, you had Saturday Night Live did a skit on it. The Tonight Show did a skit on it. So you see it becoming much more than a sports story. You see it becoming a cultural story.
And Kuhn still didn't want to back off.
Kuhn never backed off. He continued moving ahead with this court case.
And so then comes the legal action. We've got a couple of pictures of images coming up here. That was a news article about it. And I think there's another one. It's a little hard to read on the screen, but it shows and so there you are, ready with your hat and everything else to take legal action. And you're a very determined-looking woman. And so let's talk a little bit about the case itself. Was this a long court case, or was it?
It wasn't a trial in the sense that witnesses were called. And the reason something doesn't become a trial is essentially the two sides both agreed on the facts of the case. There wasn't any factual information for us to argue about where we had to call witnesses.
Okay.
So what happens in that kind of thing where there's a hearing is that there are affidavits that are done where people testify through written affidavits that are given to the judge. So before we have the hearing, she's well versed on the arguments on both sides of the case. I was deposed for 2 days by the lawyers for the other side, for Commissioner Kuhn. Commissioner Kuhn and others were deposed by my attorney. So we had a really strong record on both sides of what the facts were and what the experiences were.
Did you have the support of Sports Illustrated, or?
They were the ones who paid for it.
Oh, they did?
Time Incorporated paid for it.
And were there any baseball players that were deposed, or anybody from inside the game itself? They didn't get the...
They had some affidavits that were written. Billy Martin wrote an affidavit, the manager of the Yankees, And Tommy Lasorda, the manager of the Dodgers, also wrote an affidavit.
Well, that must have had some weight too, I would think. I mean,
well, I'm not in the judge's mind. So.
These are basically Kuhn's employees.
They're Kuhn's employees, and so basically you'd have to assume that they wrote what Kuhn wanted them to write. Yeah. And that certainly looks like it's the case, because Billy Martin welcomed me into his office. He had no problem with me being there, never told me that I shouldn't be there. He knew me very, very well, and yet his affidavit said that I shouldn't be there.
Oh, really?
So you'd have to assume that the commissioner had some impact on what he was asked to write.
Oh, that surprised me when you said that. I was thinking that you were going to get their support, but the fact that the corporation
I couldn't get their support
the corporation turned him around.
Well, you have to understand the role of the commissioner. In baseball, the role of the commissioner is godlike. It was set up after the Black Sox scandal, and the only way they could get a judge to be commissioner was to give him absolute authority over the game. And that means that owners do not disagree with him in public. The only owner who ever really disagreed with him was Charlie Finley, who had taken him to court just a year before, or actually he'd gone to court because Charlie Finley wanted to sell off his 3-star players, and the commissioner had blocked that sale. And that case in which the commissioner asserted his authority over Charlie Finley was used in our case by their attorneys as an example of why the commissioner should have such authority in this decision as well. He basically ruled in what was called the best interests of baseball. And that had been a long-standing description of his job since the Black Sox scandal in 1919, but the commissioner was brought on in the early 1920s.
Well, that was right about the time all this free agent with Curt Flood and all that was happening.
Well, he'd also just beaten Curt Flood in court. You have to remember, Commissioner Kuhn, you wonder why he took this to court, why he thought he could win. He just won a case against Curt Flood, which is a significant case. He just won a case against Charlie Finley. He'd done pretty well in court. So I don't know why we would be surprised that he would think that he could do well in court against me on this particular issue as well. I think what he failed to realize in this case is that I didn't work for him.
Yeah, okay.
I worked for Sports Illustrated, for Time Incorporated. Unlike Curt Flood, who was a baseball player, unlike Charlie Finley, who was an owner. That was in the best interests of baseball, and that was a hierarchical system. But I wasn't in that hierarchy.
I'm still blown away by the fact that the commissioner chose to challenge you. That just blows my mind. I mean, when I would have thought it would have been everybody else. But anyway, how long?
Who else could have done it but the commissioner?
I mean, I would have thought that the players and the managers would have complained to Sports Illustrated or something like that.
The players voted in favor of it.
Well, no, that's what I mean. So this, the fact that the commissioner kind of went over that is kind of mind-boggling. But anyway, so how long did the trial last?
It wasn't a trial.
No, not
it was
the trial,
hearing.
but the hearing.
The hearing was only a one-day hearing, 2.5 hours. It took place in April of 1978. And at the end of it, the Judge Constance Baker Motley, actually ordered the two sides to go back to the drawing board, try to figure it out themselves. She thought that this was a matter they ought to be able to resolve. Time Inc. ought to be able to resolve it with baseball. She should not have to write an order in this case.
Okay.
We did that for about 6 weeks. It was impossible. There was, again, no meeting of the minds, so it had to go back to her through the court system. And in September of 1978, just before the World Series would start again in 1978, again with the Yankees playing the Dodgers, that she wrote her order and made the decision against baseball.
So we have a picture of that, of victory finally coming in 1978. And so, this was a couple before that was saying they were going into court. I love that image. It's just a well-done photograph or drawing. And this was, I guess, during the case. And then here's the decision. Judge Motley. How did she happen to get this case? Was there
every judge in the federal court system gets a case through a random lottery. In this case, this is the Southern District Court of Manhattan, and it's the mother court of our country. The only court founded before the Supreme Court. And they have an old wooden box that's been there through the centuries, and they put the names of all the available judges who are sitting on that court into this box and spin it around, and then the clerk pulls a name out. And he pulled her name out. what is kind of interesting looking back in history at that is that there had been no woman before her to ever sit on this court.
Okay.
She was the first woman ever to sit on this court when she was nominated and came to this court in 1966. My case comes in 1977. She's still the only woman in the 189-year history of this court to sit on it. She's also the first Black woman who was ever put onto any federal court in this country by President Johnson. So she's an historic figure.
Yeah, I think maybe you were fortunate that you got a woman judge.
Not necessarily.
You don't think so?
I think that the fact that the baseball took it to an appellate court, the Second Circuit, and they had a hearing before 3 of the judges there in an emergency sort of summary judgment. And those 3 white men upheld her decision without finding any fault with it whatsoever.
So there was a second viewing of the.
Of course. So I don't think that we can argue that that she, because she was a woman, she, for example, never believed and never thought of herself as any part of the women's movement. She wrote that in her own autobiography.
Yeah. Okay.
This is not, I think, something where we can just look at the gender of the judge and say that because she was a woman, she made a decision, this way.
So then, after all this, you got to do the 1978 World Series.
I did. I was assigned again as a member of the Sports Illustrated baseball team of writers and reporters who would cover that series. So it was as though I had another second chance. I'd been assigned for the first time ever for myself in 1977. That chance had been blown up in Game 1. I hadn't been able to really cover that series as I was prepared to do.
But Sports Illustrated was gracious enough, or whatever the word is.
No, gracious. They knew
to send you on.
They knew a good reporter when they saw one, and they wanted me to report on it.
Yes, right. And so, in years after that, did you continue to do baseball writing?
I stayed actually with the magazine into 1979, and then I made a decision to leave. I felt that I had really spent my formative years learning about how to do journalism at Sports Illustrated. I felt like I'd learned how to do sports journalism, and now I wanted a new challenge, and that was news. And so I ended up getting hired at CBS News, and I went there.
Oh, okay. And then your baseball stuff really led you to a fair amount of recognition. You end up in the Baseball Hall of Fame indirectly, I guess, right?
Well, if you live long enough, things may turn around, and you
so
may
we have
end
an
up
image
in a place
of your
I
guess your original pass. What are these? This is the pass on the left?
That's the pass on the right. There is the one into the locker room of the New York Yankees, the last 2 games of the 77 season. And then you see my 78 World Series pass there. The one I had in 77 looks similar to that.
And a scorecard that you kept?
No, that is not my scorecard. That actually is part of another exhibit.
Oh, okay, all right. Okay, so
I did keep scorecards, but that was not mine.
Right. Okay. So then, so that all happens in the 1970s, and you've done other things since. But now you get to 2024 or somewhere around here. You start to do this book. What was the impetus for that?
I certainly didn't start doing the book in 2024.
No. Well, you had decades of thinking about it for sure, and maybe even beginning it, right? So.
Well, I actually started doing the research more than a decade ago, and the research was both extensive and intensive. I had a lot of documents to go through, all of the documents for the case. I read through many of the stories that that were written about me at the time. I went down, I'd given my papers, which included all of these documents, to the Schlesinger Library at Harvard University, Radcliffe Institute. And so I went and visited my papers day after day after day. Then I would go to New York, and my lawyers had kept 5 huge boxes full of documents. So I began to read through all of those and began to reestablish in my own mind, because it had been about 40 years, to really document whether my memories of what happened were accurate. I began to look at some of the video coverage from the day, listen to the radio coverage I could find. And so that took me some time to get that organized. And then I actually set out to write it. And I began it writing in a very traditional chronological style of just kind of telling my life story with this story as part of it. And when I just began to feel that that wasn't working at all, I abandoned that book. That had taken me almost a year and a half, 2 years to write. I just abandoned it because it just wasn't the book I felt I wanted to write. And I began to go back and explore different ways to tell this story. And what dawned on me, perhaps belatedly, is that back in the 1970s, I did not have a chance to tell my story. The story was told by male sports writers. It was told by male commentators. It wasn't told by me.
Okay.
And so it was told in a way that questioned my morality, that turned me into a sexual object. It was told in a way that looked at me as a woman who wanted to go to court so I could go into locker rooms and leer at naked men. And that was essentially the narrative that they wanted to tell. And now it was my turn to tell the story. And so I made a decision, a very purposeful decision, to write the book in a very different way. And that was to tell the story of the equal rights case, that no man showed up to listen to the hearing. It was a public hearing. Not one person who wrote about me that entire year showed up at that hearing to really understand what this case was about. They wanted it to be about my morality. And in the court of public opinion, I lost. But in the court of law, I won, and yet no one had chronicled that story of how that victory happened. So now that's the story that I have decided it's been time to tell in Locker Room Talk.
So the relevance of this book today, do I have to ask you about that? Is there a, I mean, is it...
couldn't be more relevant.
I mean, we're flooded now with women doing sports talk shows on the radio.
That isn't what this book is about.
We have women doing a lot of, things that weren't, writing, a lot of the baseball announcers are even, not a lot of them, there are some. There's still a locked door, I think, in some ways.
There's a lot happening. Yeah. There's a lot changing, both in women's sports as competitive athletes, professional athletes, also as women telling the stories of those athletes. Right. But really what this book is, in its essence, it's a story about an equal rights case. Okay. It's a story about a woman who dares to challenge a patriarchal institution. Yeah. It's still happening today. We see it with the Me Too trials, and we see what happens to the women who step forward to do that. They are often portrayed as the person who is lacking in morality. They have somehow made it so that these men have done these things to them because of the way that the woman acted or how she conducted herself. In other words, the blame is put back on her. In a lot of ways, that's what happened to me in the 70s. And so this book is really exploring what happens when you are a young woman. You do take on an institution that is and has been the bulwark of men's lives. And you are, in a sense, taking it on. And you're not saying that you want to change the institution. You're saying you want to be part of it, that you love the game just as they do. And so its essence is really a story about the fight for equal rights. That it happened to be about baseball makes it a unique story. It makes it a story that has, interest beyond perhaps a typical equal rights case, in the sense that people are intrigued by what happens in clubhouses and the idea that a woman is going into a space where women have never worked before. So it has those elements to it, but its essence is really a story about a legal case with a woman who fought for equal access and equal rights.
So how do we get the book now? Where is it on Amazon? Is
you can get the book anywhere you look for books, but you can also get it at its publisher, which is Rutgers University Press. Okay. And if you go there, Rutgers has an opportunity for you to get it at a 30% discount plus free shipping. Okay. And the way that you do that is you use the code RUSA30. And that's capital letters, RUSA30. You go to Rutgers University Press, go to my book page and put in RUSA30, and you can get it sent to you free of charge at a 30% discount.
Well, that sounds great.
It's a great way to get it.
Yes, it is. We'll put all those codes up on the screen here when you do it at a few
Fabulous.
places. But anyway, as is always the case with these half-hour interviews, it flies by. You've been an incredible guest. I've really enjoyed your hearing about your experience and the energy that you still have for all of what happened was almost 50 years ago now, I guess. In some
Almost 50 years.
Almost. So
Yeah.
thank you so much, Melissa, for coming on. And thanks to all of you out in TV land and on YouTube for checking this interesting episode out. We're on TV in Framingham on Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays at 8:30 and Saturday mornings at 7:30. But we're also on YouTube. If you look for Fan to Fan Hornfischer, you will get all the episodes, including this one. So thanks for joining us. Good night.
Thank you.